Hello, my friends. Welcome back to I think we're on day 17 by now. Oh my goodness. And we are motoring our way through the Unit 2 information on different branches. And today we're going to start one of my favorite branches, and that is the judiciary. So let's get going, shall we? All right. I have to give, where's my mouse? Come on, there we go. Okay, so you know who I am, Miss Hitch from TJ up in Virginia, down in Virginia, wherever you are relative to me. I hope you're doing well today. I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. I hope that you are finding something to bring you joy in this time. Today we are, good job, A+. There you go, mistake one for the day. We're gonna do, it's a surprise. How about that? I forgot to complete this slide. You're welcome. Remember, tomorrow is time with Jeffrey Rosen. Please sign up for that one because it'll give you an opportunity to hear about the 15 cases from an expert and get a different perspective on them. So make some time for that on Friday at 1. All right, so minor factual error. It's been a couple days, and I actually have one for you tomorrow too, but it came in a little later, so I wasn't able to fix it. But this one, it's a typo. Yep, it's supposed to be president. However, I will say this. So give me a minute here. From time to time, it is mostly going to be Congress delegating to the president. And I wouldn't use the word delegate if they're doing something for themselves. I would say that while Congress will delegate powers to the president through the legislative process, Congress will kind of create new powers for themselves. So I think the best example of that might be things like the use of the legislative veto, or, and this is getting us right into our next one, which is from my friend Faith, who I had to like not put the tweet in, sorry Faith, where recess appointments are also kind of like, it's something that's in the Constitution, but how it's been applied has shifted over time. So as you guys can tell, Faith is like, what is happening? Like the past 2 days in current events have been bananas for sure. So I want to answer some of your questions that are procedural or process oriented or substantive, but I'm going to skirt around giving any value judgments because I just want to help you kind of get some information. And then if you need to be able to process this information, then you need to go and cycle out external to this and find that stuff for yourself. So this issue yesterday with President Trump, he said that he was going to use his powers to essentially shut Congress down, and he was going to use that to appoint people using his recess appointment powers. And down in the description, I've left you a couple of links that, and I'm going to do some more like reading around, and when I find something, I'll put that in there that's like process oriented and pretty balanced in terms of how it's talking about what's going on. So the issue there is that the backstory is that obviously Congress is having a difficult time staying in session because of social distancing and COVID-19. So they have suspended their work, and the chair of the Judiciary Committee, who is Lindsey Graham, has actually been pushing through quite a few of Trump's nominees for the various, we call them Article 1 courts. Those are lifetime appointments, and they are going to be either in the Supreme Court, which that's a big deal, so we know when those happen, or in the circuit courts, which are the circuit court is an appeals court, so it's not a court of original jurisdiction, or in the district court, and that is a court of original jurisdiction. So he is frustrated because we talked about in the last class that having justices appointed is a really important component for presidents to extend their influence in office after they are gone, whether they are elected out or they have capped out in their terms. So it's really important to the presidents to want to do this, and the Republican Party has discontinued something. They've discontinued the ability to filibuster on these appointments that happened during the Trump presidency. And so they have been greenlighting a lot of these judicial candidates, but they can't right now. So what he would prefer, what Trump would prefer for the Senate to do is to do a recess or an adjournment and to suspend business, like instead of this other option they have, which is a pro forma session. So the pro forma session is a rule that was built into the Senate rules that allows them to kind of suspend animation, but not conclude the session or conclude business. And so what they have to do is they have to reconvene every 3 days and basically reconvene. And then the first motion or first order of business is they vote to take another recess. So that's important because an adjournment is a conclusion of business. And what they are able to do is to prevent that from happening so that the Senate can kind of just hit pause, essentially. So President Trump doesn't like this, and he would prefer that they were to just conclude business officially so that he can put those recess appointments in. Now, they would have to be out of business for 10 days. And as you know, that's not happening. So that's kind of what this gets at. Now, does the president have the authority to do this? Yeah. I mean, there's a couple hiccups to it, but yeah, I mean, the Senate could vote to adjourn, and if the House disagrees because they have to ask each other permission, then he can come in and kind of adjourn them for them. So it's a technicality. I think the interesting thing that we're doing here is it's an innovation in the way that this rule was originally intended. So there are, and I can do some more research, I can look into some of the historical context on this, but I haven't had an opportunity this morning. So, it's interesting to see that we have these new innovations, these informal changes to the Constitution are happening all the time. Especially during this particular time, as a president is trying to get their policy agendas pushed through Congress to the best of his abilities, trying to get his policy agenda protected by having conservatively leaning justices on the Article 1 courts, and in all other manner of legislating as well. So it will be interesting to see. I mean, there's very much so a lot of kind of shock at the adaptation of using this, which is not necessarily, I mean, obviously anything can be used for partisan purposes, but it is an innovation that has been unexpected, and that is why you're seeing some of the outrage, shock, support out of conservatives who feel as though that the president has the right to go ahead and put people in office that are beneficial to the country's running. And another great question here has to do, and it's kind of a technical one, how long are they allowed to be in office? And it depends on whether the recess happens between sessions or within sessions. But generally speaking, the answer is anywhere from a couple of months to 2 years. I mean, it just depends on when that timing is. So, stay tuned is all I can really say. Moving on, Luke wants to bring after we've had that heavy conversation of some really technical stuff, Luke wants to bring some lightness to the conversation. So thank you, Luke. I enjoyed it this morning. It made me chuckle. All right. So let's get to our warm up. Now, the one thing I want to say is that I have so many, the number of FRQs that are being put under the hashtag APLoveGov are immense. I mean, I'm so excited to see that. It's heartwarming for me because it means that I'm reaching high levels of engagement. I'm very excited about it. I've asked for assistance from teachers to help give some feedback because just like they have their own students, I'm also a teacher. I have 146 students that are in school right now. And so I have a responsibility to grade their work. And when I can, I'm going back and grading other students' work. But to get to every single one of you who wants help, which I really want to help all of you, it's kind of driving me nuts, but I also need to sleep. So I've recruited some teachers. So if you see an adult who's commenting on your FRQ and you're like, what is this? It's probably going to be a teacher. So don't freak out, right? Like take what they're saying, and they are there's so many amazing teachers who are responding to this call to make sure that you guys are getting the feedback that you need. So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at our FRQ. You guys had one on the Patriot Act. I have a sample here. I'm going to live grade it in front of you. I just need to find it, and we'll see how this goes. So here it is. All right. Our question is about the Patriot Act, as you guys know, right? We're looking at A, describe a section of the Constitution that a group such as the American Civil Liberties Union would likely say is most affected by the US Patriot Act. So again, like as I walk through this, the one thing that I want to say is that even if you've never heard of the US Patriot Act, even if you don't know anything about it, even if you don't know what happened on September 11th, you don't necessarily have to. It's contextual clues, but it's not an expectation that you are an expert on these components of the prompt. What you should do is go through this and read through between the lines, like what is happening here. So we're seeing here that Congress passed a law in 45 days, right? And that law is going to do something to enhance the federal government's ability to connect with our private information. So we're not talking about things that are like publicly available. We're talking about private emails, private phones, right? Then we get to the FBI. I see the FBI. I have to think here. So we've got Congress legislating, we've got expanded powers for the government. We have the FBI, which is a government bureaucracy, a member of the government bureaucracy who is been given enhanced powers. We call that delegating powers from Congress, right? And then we see broad support for these additional measures was quick support to Congress. Where does this broad support come from? That is in oblique reference to the people. So to some degree, the people were totally cool with this idea of enhancing the government's ability to be able to look at private communications. Right. But we do see a caveat here. We see the American Civil Liberties Union, and that sounds like a special interest group to me. So I have a lot of different players here, and I want to make sure that I reference that you need to talk about the players in the proper nouns that are given, but you should process it and say, okay, like what is the heart of this conversation, so that I, don't go, oh my God, I get distracted because you just don't know who these people are. So we have, and I've been counseling you to describe and explain, identify, describe, and explain, right? So in our identify, describe, and explain, A says, describe a section of the Constitution that a group such as the ACLU would likely say is most affected by the USA Patriot Act. I know it says describe. We want to go a little bit beyond that, right? So a section of, I like this repetition of our prompt, a section of the Constitution that's beneficial to, then it's okay that we don't have, this should say American, but you know what? We call this a hashtag MFE, right? It's okay. The ACLU would be the due process clause, which is meant to guarantee due process and respect individual rights from unconstitutional infringement of life, liberty, and property. So we have, what I like here is that this is a identify, right? We've identified, oops, I have to make sure, I can't see if you guys are following along because I am in the different thing. Okay, yeah. So we have identified our clause, and then we've defined it or described it. Either way, that's great, right? Okay, which infringes, it can be certainly claimed the Patriot Act infringes on rights and personal lives of civilians without their consent or their constitutional support. So this is an interesting one, because I think I probably first would have gone to, instead of saying the due process clause, I probably first would have said that this kind of lends back to the 14th Amendment and a violation of equal protection, right? Now, I know that if we look at the Equal Protection Clause, it says states, but there's this process called reverse incorporation in which the federal government has been held to the equal protection as well. But due process is getting at our ability to have these rights. So this is, I think, for the most part, I'm comfortable with this, right? We're getting here. We could also say maybe the First Amendment, right? Although that is maybe a little bit of a stretch, because there we're looking for that, we're looking at the right of association there. So this kind of is bleeding over into our other conversation we'll be having a little bit later next week. All right. So then we come up against our next question, which is to explain the checks and balances, how the checks and balances could work to ensure the section of the Constitution identified in A would be protected. So checks and balances, right? So we're going to give us, I especially like the life, liberty, and property, right? It's pretty good. So yay, good job. Checks and balances could limit the reach of the recently passed act, right? We refer to it as, I know this is like getting here with this, but Patriot Act put the whole shebang there. And again, that's MFE, right? But again, we want to make sure that we're seeing some semblance or some like grounding in the document or in this prompt. So if we're looking to prevent the former stated constitutional infringement, besides states outright refusing to ignore the act, the Supreme Court could directly declare it unconstitutional, as in a particular case, to the legislative and executive branch in accordance with the act. Okay, so a couple things here, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. The issue with the Supreme Court is that is definitely something that Supreme Court could do, but we're making some presumptions here. Number one, the Supreme Court doesn't render a decision unless there is a case before them. So a case actually has to make it to the Supreme Court. And number two, they are able to construct the cases that they will hear. So I mean, yes, absolutely. The Supreme Court could declare it unconstitutional, right? But I'm a little thrown off here on the word directly, because to me, it sounds a little bit like we're doing this, we're preempting any enforcement. And there's some stuff that we're going to talk about that I'm actually going to give you guys a video that talks about how to understand how courses matriculate their way through the Supreme Court. That is important for us to have this couched, right? So if we were concerned, but you know what, it is a check, right? All right, so what would significantly grant them support and power within the bureaucracy, like leaving the judicial branch without popular support? I don't know how the bureaucracy and the judicial branch would necessarily interplay, because it's not specific. And here, again, I'm having some difficulty in terms of seeing exactly the actions that the bureaucracy would be saying. You've identified the bureaucracy, but I don't know what they're going to be doing. The only thing that you've said is that the Supreme Court could declare it unconstitutional should a case become before it. And I think that this is probably our best bet here. Okay. So there's some things here that I want to point out to you that make sure, again, that you're giving me the actor and the action, so that we're very clear in crisp language who's doing what, so that I can see how these things are interplaying. And I'd actually have to sit and think about this one again, probably off camera, and give you a little bit better an understanding of how I feel about that one. We'll go down to C. C talks about, over time, some measure of the USA Patriot Act has been challenged by state governments who do not wish to cooperate with the federal government. Explain a concept of the American government and politics this action illustrates. All right, so states refusing to cooperate with federal government. Right, so this kind of tells us that you could have expanded on this issue right here, right? But again, we didn't explain it and we didn't describe it, so it's difficult for us to really know what it is, and I wouldn't count that as a point. That's just an identify. Should states refuse to allow or follow federal or government enacted policies, this would now be referred to as nullification, which, such as what several southern states did after Brown v. Board, or to slow or stop the spreading of desegregation by outright ignoring the ruling, which did end up slowing the process. Okay. Nullification actually requires an act. They can just ignore it. They can just not follow it. So nullification to me, is an actually specific action taken by a legislative body to state this is what we're doing, this is what we're not doing, so on and so forth. So that one is a little I have to like sit and think about it again, but I usually counsel kids to use the term ignore or refuse to enforce, or right, or continue to enforce the law as it was, because there is no constitutional ability for courts to be able to enforce decisions that are made. So this one is a really great start. There's some words here that like cause me a little bit of hesitancy, and my bigger concern here is that we go back and we make sure that we've got our describe and explain verbs down, right? And the other thing too is keep in mind, you don't have to come up with the most creative solution. Come up with a one that is what I call the lowest hanging fruit. What's the most logical thing that they would do? Courts nullifying, passing a law that explicitly states like we're not going to do this is probably not likely. It's like it's possible and it could be an answer, but it's a risky one in that there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, and you are not getting graded on how creative your answers are. You're getting graded on how clear your answers are and rooted in the Constitution in this case. All right, so the Fourth Amendment, here we go. Fourth Amendment, right? Search warrant without obtaining anything. This is excellent. I see the American Civil Liberties Union. This one I see probably getting the plus, right? Right, so we've identified it, we've defined it, and we have gone through and said why or how the ACLU would be unhappy because it's getting into the citizens' right of rights and privileges. Checks and balances and protection of the Fourth Amendment by vetoing the law. Very clear, very low hanging fruit, very easy for us to see, very good, right? Increase the president's popularity and the public could resent in Congress. This act, and then there's an example here. So we're going off script, which is a creative way of illustrating a point when we talk about state children's health insurance, or CHIP. Termination. So you're making, you're explaining it using this example of how this would work. So I see here both, if we see a describe, like we're looking at the president vetoing, I see a description, and then I want to see, yeah, this is our explain, right? Because you terminated act, making the legislation thus ineffective. Excellent, very good. Low hanging fruit, good, good. All right, the next one, a concept in which a state has their own powers separate from the state would be reserved powers of the states as outlined. States have rights such as the education, we've identified reserved powers, we're describing it, right? An example would be refusal to open up upon Trump's request. The ignoring, modern day can just ignore, right? Can fail to. And this, again, like maybe a stronger word is fail to enforce, etc. Just because ignoring slightly, well, I mean, inaction is an action. So, I mean, I'll give it to you, right? But it's curious. All right, very good. Excellent, excellent job, my friends. You did it. Yay. All right. Let's get back to our PowerPoint presentation, shall we? And yes, here we are. Thank you so much. Okay. So I want to start our conversation about the courts by referring or referencing back to something we've talked about, which is the Madisonian system of government. And I've had a couple of different ways of presenting this to you. All of these are important because this is the context through which we will be operating, right? So it's kind of like, this is the baseline structure. This is the itemized rules that were put together through systems of compromise within the Constitutional Convention. And this is what was debated and was illuminated in those ratifying conventions. So we have here that we've got a federal system in conjunction with consent of being governed through elections in a Republican government. We have checks and balances, and we have separation of powers. Those are our four kind of like legs of the table that support our Madisonian system of government. We've talked a lot about them, and we will continue to talk about them today. When we turn the corner into our essential documents, here what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk a little bit maybe about starting to categorize what's happening in each of these documents. There are segments that are process oriented that tell you kind of like how things work, right? Like wheels of gears turning together to make things happen. And then substantive, they're giving you reasoning, they're explaining why, right? And they usually are answering or stating because these are the things that we're concerned about. And they're going to relate back to those those pieces of information that we've talked about. So what we really should start doing is thinking about them thematically, right? Like packaging them up. If we're thinking about participatory, how might people in each, or how might we find things in each of these documents that support it? We might go to letters, we might go to 10, we might go to articles. I'm sorry, not articles, but Brutus, so on and so forth. So just kind of start pulling together those documents in a thematic way. It might help you prepare for the exam. Today, we're going to turn a little bit back to kind of checks and balances. We're going to talk about the court's creation and some of the more important things that come out of the courts, particularly the concept of judicial review. So I want to start with our argument that is going to be presented by Brutus again, right? We go back to Brutus, don't rush ratification. We're here. This is going to echo in history, the most important thing you're ever going to do. And then he's going to turn in that document to talking about the courts. And here he is a little alarmed. And when I say a little, I mean a lot, alarmed about the concurrent power that's held by a federal and a state court to hear cases. He recognizes that the way in which the Constitution is written will create a court system in which you have options in terms of who you want to hear these issues, depending on, I mean, they're not like unlimited options, but there are some options out there. And so in addition to that, you're going to have a state-sponsored court that's going to be planted, firmly rooted in each of the states. That's going to be judging and exercising their ability to kind of interpret the state constitution in conjunction with a federal court that will also be in each of the states. And there's this concern there that the states are, even though they're could be sitting right next door to each other, right? And you have this concept of perhaps having options in some cases. In particular, we really see some of those options come to fruition before we've fully understood what the due process clause in the Fifth Amendment meant before the case Barron v. Baltimore, which could have potentially opened the door for the federal government really kind of squashing the sovereignty of the states. So you see where he's pointing out, like, maybe we should think about this a little deeper, right? That the jurisdiction, except in cases that the powers of the courts is extensive. Their jurisdiction comprehends all civil cases except in cases that arise between citizens of the same state. And it extends to all cases in law in equity arising under the Constitution. So you have an inferior court in every single state, and you'll have executive officers that are doing things in that state, in that court, who are paid for by the federal government. They are totally independent of the states. They derive their authority from the United States. They're receiving fixed salaries. They're guaranteed to have this. And this is his view of a monster that is planted in each state. It's just going to swallow wholesale the authority that those states might have. So it's interesting that he brings up payment. I anticipate a question might be, well, why does it matter who pays the justices? And it does, it matters a lot. Remember, payment from one party to another creates dependence between the payer and the payee. So one is serving the other's wishes. And it's really critically important for us to remember that as soon as we took the authority to pay congressmen, to pay the president, to pay the courts out of the authority of the state's hands, that they didn't have an opportunity to say, I'm not going to pay for this. Just like the World Health Organization, you see this going on right now with President Trump to threaten to cut funding. That ability for them to say, you're not doing what I want, so I'm not going to pay for this product anymore, makes that organization subservient to whatever your needs are. And this idea of having all of these individuals' payments come out of the federal treasury means that the only thing that they are responsible to is the federal government. So Federalist 78, again, we don't have a refutation necessarily, we have a rebuttal where Hamilton is going to say, I think we're arguing something, I want to point something out to you that maybe you didn't consider. and that is that we need an independent judiciary. It's kind of a new innovation for national governments, kind of, sort of, but just like anything else, it's evolved. So what it was in 1787, in 1789, in terms of in the writings of Hamilton, are very different from what they are today. So this job is very serious, and he's like, we don't want any slouches in office. We want people who are going to get things done. So the thing that needs to be done is they need to be an independent judiciary. They're not reliant upon the people. They're not reliant upon Congress to write checks for them. They're not reliant upon elections. They're independent, and they can really sit back and judge the Constitution versus everything else that comes before them, all the other controversies that might arise. So they're going to establish a standard of good behavior. Right now, that seems like a really strange thing that opens the door that if you're not behaving, that you can be impeached, which is definitely something coming out of Article 1 and that can be done to take people out of office. And we have impeached federal judges. In fact, most of the offices that we've impeached have been federal judges. But good behavior is a weird term. It's not that you're doing what the president wants. Good behavior for us today mostly means that you are showing up to work and you're doing the best that you can given the things that are presented to you. So things that people have been impeached for have not been handing down partisan decisions or handing down decisions that have partisan impact. Instead, what they have been impeached for is things like being having a chemical dependence on something or things of that nature, right? Where they're not trustworthy to hold these powers in the public for the public's good. So he is going to create a standard of good behavior. He's going to say it's the most valuable one that's there. It's going to be required that you are not going to be like there's going to be no encroachments from the executive or the Congress to get the courts to do what they want, right? He also doesn't want it to be too dependent on the whims of one body. So the presidential appointment will ground it to one person who represents the entire nation, and then giving it to the Senate gives the states the ability to weigh in on justices serving in their neck of the wood, and it's also an opportunity for states to kind of give their concerns through that confirmation process. It's almost the root of senatorial courtesy, which is a maybe still alive, maybe not concept. Circa 2017, I think, is when I heard of the blue slip process kind of being threatened a little bit, where the senior ranking senator has the ability to give recommendations on who should be appointed for positions that are open around the country, because they want to pick somebody who has who understands the community there. And so that was something that parties in the attempt to consolidate power have kind of walked away from and said that we just want to kind of pull from a national pool of people who are representing what the parties want and not necessarily the things that are important to you at the local and the state level. So anyways, another story for another day. Our judiciary has to interpret the Constitution, and so a dependence on any of the other components of the Madisonian system of government makes it difficult to interpret in a vacuum. There will always have an interest. So the courts there are animated to be passive. They are there to kind of have time and space to truly root around in issues that are brought to the courts in terms of whether or not they are controversial or constitutional controversies, or individuals who feel as though their rights have been violated under the Bill of Rights. Whatever it might be, there's time to really weigh those issues and to think seriously about the implication of their decisions. So really important component here that he says, and he has this lovely language that talks about the unique powers of each branch. The branch of Congress has the power of the purse. They are the animating force. They not only tell us what they're going to do, but they make it possible for things to be done because they pay for it. Following through on all those promises. You have the president, who is the power of the sword, who is there to act as a single individual to defend the nation's interests. And then you have the courts, and they are there to interpret. And I really do think of it as art, right? Like they're looking at the language of the Constitution, and they have to turn and apply that language in a new light. So it is very much so like they're an artist in a studio trying to replicate an image in front of them, like a still life. Well, as soon as they start to take a real life picture in front of them and put it on a canvas, they're going to start inserting their own perspective, their own taste, their own flair, and it runs the gamut from how true to life it is or not. So these are our powers that are there. And there's something that he talks about. The judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over either the sword or the purse, no direction either of the strength or of the wealth of society, and can take no active resolution whatsoever. It may truly be said that neither has force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend on the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. Very passive, very, very passive branch, but important because they have to exercise discretion in figuring out when you have two laws or a law in the Constitution or an action in the Constitution that's in conflict, which one is negated or voided out by the other. So here that you hear in Federalist 78, he talks about negating or voiding or nullification. He's a little bit of a different context here, so don't get thrown off by it. But that is, to some degree, that's kind of like he's referencing judicial review, and it's essential, right? So that's where we come to the voiding or nullification of laws, which is the spark of judicial review, which brings us to completely different interpretations of the powers of the Constitution, one that is static and fixed, the other that is dynamic and evolving over time. And just like anything else, we can look at these in terms of a liberal interpretation or a conservative interpretation, and look at them through the different strands of our Madisonian system of government. So Marbury versus Madison, something that we do need to know. We've talked about Marbury already. We know that this is the case that is going to establish the precedent of judicial review, or the act of nullifying an action of Congress when there's a violation with supremacy clause. And the violation here came from the passage of the Judiciary Act, granting powers to the courts that didn't exist. And so that is why that was removed. And that's where we come back to Marshall's very famous quote that it's emphatically the province and the duty of the judicial department, words are hard, to say what the law is. And if two laws are in conflict with each other, the courts must decide on the operation of each. So, and we're going to talk about judicial review tomorrow. Some things about it, it's evolved. Number one, it's not a precise meaning, and it really has taken a life on its own. It's not even a word that was used until I spent a lot of time looking this up, but I call it source amnesia when I read something somewhere and I can't remember where I read it. So this might be an MFE, but I believe it was created in the early 20th century. Check me if you dare. I challenge you. All right. So it was experimented in the colonies, and the state courts had an ability to nullify or void laws. It had it been something that was an express power, it possibly could have tanked the ratification, because there's a difference in how, like, there's kind of a really important difference that we're going to get into tomorrow on how this could be understood. It was recognized the supremacy clause created an opportunity to void laws. This really wasn't something that was debated during the ratification debates, but voiding is like passive, right? It's just like, oh, that doesn't exist anymore. Judicial review that we know it today is a little bit more than that. And Hamilton, he really focused on his essay in 78. He focused way more on the possibility of Congress being tyrannical, and very much so less on. He downplayed the whole point that was being made by Brutus, that this isn't about states doing something tyrannical, because the states had a Bill of Rights, and that was a primary way of controlling tyrannical behavior. This was about Congress being able to curb tyrannical actions. And remember, at the time of the writing of 78, the Bill of Rights didn't exist. It's not going to exist until 1790 it'll take 2 years for it to make its way through there. And the reason why it didn't exist was because Hamilton and Madison and all of those guys strongly felt like, hey, the English, they gave us a Bill of Rights and they completely ignored it time and time again. The problem was not that we don't have rights. The problem is that you are not appropriately turning the government in on itself to be limited, to operate under the rule of law, to have systems of checks and balances, to be able to animate any action taken to curb that intrusion in our natural rights. And it has to be branch against branch, not person against branch. And finally, Congress enabled to some extent the judicial review in the Judiciary Act 1789. So again, just more evidence that this isn't something that was like poof, just existed on the face of the earth here. And it mostly is understood as a legitimate power, not just as an act of negating today. And we're going to get into that tomorrow. Okay, so let's turn. We're going to take a look at a different, I'm going to do one of these in front of you. So that means that it's my turn to get very nervous because you are all going to judge me harshly. Maybe I'll get it right, maybe I won't. Who knows? It'll be a surprise, right? So remember, we are overdoing this FRQ because it is 40% of the test, and we want to make sure that in that 15 minutes you've left no stone unturned to get as far as you can. Remember, the verbs mean something. I know that you don't see in the stuff that's coming off of my AP, you don't see the describe explain that College Board has said will be in question 2. We're just going to have to insert it, a little carrot. We're just going to remember, like, we're overdoing it, right? It's all good. So a couple things to avoid. I've already told you, passive voice is a dead in the water scenario. I want you to read this. The holding was decided for the Jefferson administration. The Supreme Court decided for the Jefferson administration. What's the difference between those two? I don't know who's doing what when I say the holding was decided. So you need to make sure that you put a person, an institution, something like that in that as the subject. Don't put them anywhere else. Put them right in the front, right? Avoid pronouns. Why? The state's electors represent the preference of the voters, or they represent the preference of the voters. Which one is better? I know who the actors are. I don't in the second one. Even if it's referred to before, it's still not a clear way of writing, particularly if you have multiple actors who've been introduced. Common nouns, get rid of them. The legislatures redistrict state electoral districts versus the state legislatures redistrict state electoral districts. Whew. Yeah, we need to be precise, especially when there's multiple institutions that are similar. When you use imprecise language, you are opening the door that you don't get the point. All right, so let's practice. Take a moment. I want you to read this. This is a practice that I created for this that I'm going to do. You guys are going to do in my one from my AP tonight so that it is congruent with what College Board is saying. So pause the video, take a look at that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hack this in front of you in a very, probably like 5 minutes, because that's about all I have, right? Something like that. Okay. Back to my screen. Yeah, I got no time. Good job. Stop talking so much. Okay. Federal agencies publicly declared health problems at great, right? Public and private positions of the agency became known with a private conversation between a guy who owns, that should say Care McGee, and a regulatory agency known as the Atomic Energy Commission. So I see here that this is a federal regulatory agency. Moving on. Hearing was held, we're in a hearing, right? So we have the House Small Business Committee, Subcommittee on Energy and Environment. So now I see that I am talking about Congress. Even if I've never heard of that, that is okay. And I also am talking about a corporation, all right? So corporation, a bureaucracy, and Congress. Federal investigation of Care McGee began in '74 after the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers International Union. What is that? That's a special interest group. After they said that Miss Silkwood's death might not have been accidental. AEC investigated all allegations she made about safety practices. 2 months before her car crashed into a culvert, the AEC issued a report and a company press release on the investigations. They said allegations were substantiated, da, 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 da. Lots of details. Do I need to know who Karen Silkwood is? Do I need to know what the investigations are? No, we are looking for the things that can be discussed based on this. Can you identify what's going on? And we have. We've identified Congress. We've identified bureaucracy, a company, special interest group. I even saw here hearing, right? So we're doing some kind of hearing. Perchance, it sounds like an oversight hearing. Let's hold on to that. So let's describe a power that Congress can use to address the issues and comments. Well, what's the most obvious thing? They're already doing a hearing. What's the most obvious thing that Congress can do? I know you're saying it. Congress can legislate to redefine how the AEC investigates complaints in the, what is this? Nuclear industry, period. So identify, and I've described, right? They redefine. This is actually, I'm going to say, this is probably not the best word. They can re-legislate. Redefine is not a very good word, is it? No, it's not very clear what they're doing. So re-legislate, let's get more specific. How they investigate complaints into the nuclear industry. Now I need to tell you, explain it, right? So by re-legislating, Congress can force, it sounds like this is an issue of transparency, more disclosure by the AEC in their investigations into issues of public concern. Period. End of discussion. Moving on. Boom, vanquished it. B, in the context of this scenario, explain and describe. Welcome to my chicken scratch. How the use of Congress's power described in Part A can be affected by its interaction with the Atomic Energy Commission. Okay. B. So we are looking to see what can the AEC do to influence Congress's output. AEC, we know this is like, actually, you know what this is? This is an iron triangle question. So the AEC can present information and reports on investigations. Investigations to what? We have to be specific here. So let's use the prompt into Care McGee. What are they doing? They are doing bad things, hazards. Present information by testifying in hearings. That is my specific thing that they're doing here. Testifying in additional hearings. Let's make sure that we say that's after that. Now we have to explain how this works. AEC can bring that proves, bring evidence that proves they have no conflict of interest in regulating Care McGee, right? Because they're being accused of that. by disclosing their investigatory processes. Boom, done. This is my explain, right? Presenting information in hearings. Yeah, iron triangle. That's one of the parts. C, in the context of the scenario, explain how the interaction between Congress and the AEC can be affected by the Oil and Chemical and Atomic Workers International Union. So this is another part, right? The Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers International Union can, let's say they go public. Go public and notify members of the union that Congress is investigating the AEC and Kerr-McGee. They can, oops, I just use a pronoun. Let's say the union can ask members to call or write committee members in DC to influence more restrictive measures in the law. Boom, done. Time me, 6 minutes. Boom, I finished it. How did you do? Okay. I'm not bragging, I promise. There's probably lots of mistakes in it. Go find it. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Check for understanding. Let's hope that we don't have any mistakes in this. Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton states, Constitution is, in fact, and must be regarded by the judges as fundamental law. It therefore belongs to them to ascertain its meaning, which of the following court cases is most relevant to this statement. Our answer here is, I hope am I on the right one? Yes, okay. Our answer here is going to be Marbury. We've already talked about all those cases. You know what they are. Which of the following sections of the U.S. Constitution is most related to the case in Marbury versus Madison? You know it because we already talked about it. It's 3. Very good. All right. Debrief and summary. I'm skipping it because we had a bad slide. Good job, Ms. Hitch. Here is your exam practice. You are looking at lovely stuff from the Republican Party and the Federal Reserve. You got a bunch of stuff to work on here. Put it on Twitter. If I don't grade it, please don't be mad at me. I'm trying my hardest to keep up with everything. I'm asking teachers to help me so that you can get feedback because you guys are doing amazing work. You have such great questions. Keep it up. I'm so proud of you. You're going to do amazing on this test. Thank you for watching. And I have no resources to share with you today. So I will say goodbye to you, my friends. Please stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, and we will see you next class.